My name is Lexa Grachishkin. I'm from Mount Vernon High School and I'm performing this informative for the 2021 State IE Tournament. The mind-numbing boredom of quarantine and the isolation caused by COVID has caused all of us to turn to new hobbies or readopt hobbies of the past in search of any entertainment we can get. Who hasn't seen a social media post about someone poking fun at millennials, investing in stocks, or trying their very hardest to master the newest TikTok dance? However, there's one phase that hasn't made a comeback, and yet deserves a second look. It's about time we all don our polyester leisure suits and gold chains as we get ready to jungle boogie through the groovy sound of the 1970s. Disco music. By embracing disco as a form of entertainment while we attempt to avoid any Saturday night fevers during this pandemic, we can better understand its unique cultural relevance and see that you and I will survive all this hot stuff. The music we identify as disco today first emerged in the early 1970s, as groups of the 50s and 60s like the Beach Boys or the Monkees gradually began to be replaced by the fresh sound of groups like ABBA or the Bee Gees. Born out of exclusive, membership-only clubs throughout the US and Europe, disco flew below the radar of the general public because of its role as a reaction against the mainstream white rock groups of the time. But the term disco was actually first coined all the way back in the 1940s, when clubs across Paris began using turntables instead of live bands to play songs for clubgoers. This means that some of the world's very first nightclubs were actually considered discotheques. But disco stylistically didn't emerge until the mid-1970s, when clubs across the US began mimicking Eurodisco in a unique and new club setting. Up until this point, the group disco catered to was exclusive and stayed out of the public eye. But soon, mainstream insight into these secretive venues sparked the disco inferno in the United States that we know and love today. In 1971, disco was televised for the first time ever through the Soul Train music and dancing show. And when music critic Vince Zaletti began attending the dance club The Loft, he became enamored with disco culture and was motivated to publish the first mainstream article about disco in the Rolling Stone, titled Discotheque Rock. At this point, everyone was saying, "I love the nightlife," resulting in Donna Summer, ABBA, and the Bee Gees topping charts and staying alive in our playlist to this very day. Before the 1970s, there weren't any stations playing disco on US radio. But by the time 1978 rolled around, there were 200 disco-only radio stations across the United States alone, causing small underground clubs to grow to accommodate high-tech speakers, large crowds, and of course, the classic disco ball. But from its conception, disco has fundamentally been an art form of resistance. The clubs in Europe that laid the groundwork for disco stylistically actually came about after Hitler labeled any music created by a non-white artist as a degenerate influence. This led French resistance groups to create hidden underground discotheques, where these music could be enjoyed and celebrated in peace. Even under the strict rule of Stalin in the USSR, dancing at disco clubs was still permitted. However, the USSR began to freak out as disco culture began to be seen as subversive. Soon, DJs and music were subject to strict regulation, and dances couldn't occur without a reason for the dance being submitted to the government beforehand. There was no love train for disco. We remember jazz for the way it amplified black artists in the 1920s, rock and roll as a rebellious movement against established norms in the 60s, and when we think of disco, we think of tacky, blatantly commercialistic 70s fads. But our conception of disco as superficial and surface level means that we miss out on the critical nuance the genre holds and the impact it's had on our society at large. For starters, when disco came about, the singers of the most popular songs had feminine voices, and for the first time, it was women who were topping charts consistently. Additionally, the club setting of the music meant the singers no longer had to water down their lyrics to make them radio-friendly, giving us classics like "Shake Your Booty" and "Do You Think I'm Sexy?" This focus on sexuality via music made a dramatic departure from the past, where the few songs that didn't sweep sexuality under the rug focused entirely on the desire that women created in men. However, prominent female artists like Donna Summer recenter this narrative, instead choosing to sing their songs about the power that women derived from embracing their own power and sexuality, leading to singles like Love to Love You Baby to top charts for months at a time. This newfound empowerment arose partially as a result of the victory second-wave feminism gained in the early 70s. With the Roe v. Wade decision, the ERA gaining traction, and Title IX's passage, now was a critical time for a feminist movement, and disco was at the forefront. This was then reflected in disco's fashion scene, where billowy pants, wrap dresses, and sequin bodysuits became the must-have pieces of the decade. Some feminists denounced disco fashion, labeling it as objectification of the female body, but designers and dancers alike defended their style. Much like the lyrics of the songs themselves, disco fashion was all about empowerment for the individual, giving clubgoers the choices to choose between styles that ran the gamut, from modest to revealing. Additionally, don't stop till you get enough, because disco's expression engendered fresh and Black Latinx artists who had previously been shunned artistically by society. Before disco, most Black music was referred to as primitive by white society. But the fact that disco was rooted in funk, which came from soul, and the persistent use of Black rhythms and chanted beats demonstrated how it was Black culture that was actually the critical vehicle to disco's success. The physical space disco occupied became a symbol of equality as well. Prior to the 1970s, most dancing was restricted to couples dancing between a male and a female only, and dancing between two males had actually been outlawed by New York City. However, disco shattered this norm and instead catered to large group dancing, giving LGBTQ individuals a safe space to dance together and enjoy the nightlife just like everyone else. Clubs like the Saints, or the Vatican of disco, took traditionally heteronormative spaces and aesthetics and turned them on their heads to make unique places of community and gathering that were unlike any other. When examining the movement from today's perspective, it's clear that it still left its mark. For starters, by pioneering the 12-inch single, disco has, in turn, led to the dance tracks we listen to today being longer, giving us all more time to act as dancing queens. Additionally, disco gave rise to DJing as a common practice. Since dance culture was so critical to disco stylistically, DJs had to use new and innovative techniques like listening ahead through headphones or remixing to keep their audiences engaged. But most importantly, disco was a genre that stood up against prejudice and actively created safe spaces for marginalized communities. However, soon, disco had its last dance. As the genre became perceived as popular, it led to an influx of white, working-class youth into the scene, which subsequently led to the gentrification of the genre. For the most part, queer and Black artists retained their success, but soon, small independent record labels became overtaken by large conglomerates. The Disco Sucks movement came to represent the pinnacle of resentment from white rock fans. Rooted in racism and homophobia, the largest known Death to Disco rally was hosted in late July of 1979. Fans who brought a disco record to be burned and destroyed on the field got a reduced ticket price to see the White Sox play, which led to a crowd of over 59,000 people attending, and burning records of not only disco artists, but also queer and POC artists in general. As journalist Dave March reflected, young, white males were the most prominent group in attendance, because they were the ones who felt the most threatened by the equity and community that disco fostered. As the years went on, disco became aired less and less on the radio, and gradually faded out of popular culture. Today, you might hear disco on the odd radio throwback or a random playlist, but other genres of music still get resounding recognition for the impact they've left on today's society. And yet, we all still fail to perceive disco as anything beyond the surface-level, tacky 70s fad aspect. However, if we're able to take a step back and embrace disco as well as the ideologies disco fostered, we might realize that once we understand that we are family, it's all a boogie wonderland.